And we're up to our usual almost quota, not quite.
I am recording now. At this point, I think everybody knows me and knows Don. I will be muting people as if I see like you're popping to the foreground or there's a lot of noise happening in your background. There's nothing personal. Unmute yourself if you want to talk. We do these things as kind of a discussion, even though Don assures me that this one is more of a presentation than normal. And I don't think Don needs an introduction. The guy who wrote Ferris Wheel and did the metal image video, we've all seen it. Take it away, Don.
I got it. How do I do that now? Oh, share screen. Well, let's start with this. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be, all 21 of us. This is a topic that I've learned a lot about a long time ago and have found it very useful to me and lots of people over the years. I've gone to lots of talks over the years about teaching. And in general, there's a 5% overlap. I was very pleased to see when Betsy Gata did a presentation on class several weeks ago that was a much, much larger overlap, but I'll be stressing it a little differently. So without stressing out, let's see if I can get this to, ta-da! Oh, and at this point I've lost my cursor, so I'm only looking at me and not others. I'm gonna go away from that just a second. Somebody told me it was nice that I could just push escape. Let's see. I like to see your faces too when I'm talking. This way I'll be able to see at least a few of them. How's that look? No. Sorry about that. We'll figure it out eventually. All right, let's go back to opening this. And I assume everyone can see this fine. We're going to be talking about teaching dancers so that they will learn. And this slide says the same thing. Whoopee. I'm going to be presenting ideas about teaching that I've learned from non-square dance sources. If time permits, we'll also talk about a few specific calls, but I don't really want to run too long. So what are the goals of teaching dancers? And in no particular order, because I couldn't figure out what order to put these in. And I don't like the term I came up with, make more dancers, but we want to increase our dancer population. So that's one of the things we would want to do while we're teaching. When we teach people, we want to not just teach them the dance. I think in general, we want to teach them to join the activity, to become members of your club or the local square dance scene or the national square, whatever it is. But we want to make them so that when they graduate, they can dance and integrate into the group, into the activity as easily as possible. Specifics, we want to teach them so they respond correctly to your words. You say a you word, another caller says a command, and they know how to physically respond to that, and sometimes emotionally. And I find it really amazing when doing party nights how quickly they learn to respond to the commands and to ignore the filler words. It's pretty quick that happens, and it's amazing. Since we normally don't charge for a series of lessons, but if they had a good time, they come back. If they weren't embarrassed, they come back. If they can, they come back. But if they don't have to come back. And so basically at each session, you want to convince them to come back voluntarily. Don't scare them away, send them away. And part of that whole process is entertain them. That's what we all are about. people learn by doing. Now, I know there's a lot of people that talk about there are different ways to learn. I'll get into that a little, but the main thing is physically, if you get your body to go through it, there's parts of it that learn it by doing that. They learn by doing. So what you want to be sure is the first time they do it right. Do anything in your power to let them do it right. Because if they do it wrong, if your description or demo or what have you wasn't good enough, then they're going to do it wrong, and they've learned not only the right way, but the wrong way. And you can actually never unlearn the wrong way. It turns out that you've learned both of them. You can't unteach the wrong way. All you can do is drum in the right way much better. So, you know, eventually you call square through, and most of the time they're going to do it right. But if all of a sudden there's a panic, that other thing is lingering there, and it's going to pop out and get in your way. So don't let them do it wrong. Do everything in your power to let them do it right the first time. Now, there are different ways. Most callers, I think most callers, will just get up and talk about what's going on. But there's some calls that a demonstration works better. And the few that I do that with is not having a square demonstrated, but I'm talking about 2 people calls where I will, for instance, star through. I'll bring a dancer up on stage, a brand new dancer, and physically walk through it, talking it while I'm doing it. You know, you're facing the person, you join inside hands, and I can grab the appropriate hand, so it doesn't matter which one that woman knows. You can turn her under and end in the facing direction, and then you have them do the same thing. You know, after you've demonstrated the starting and ending formation, you can have them walk through it while you're doing it. There's certain calls, and I don't always do this, but I would whenever possible, is use a blackboard. I think there's no better way to teach circulates than draw a circulate path that people move this way or that way around the path. Cloverleaf, I love to teach with a blackboard. I think it really gives them an idea that I usually draw after the cloverleaf paths, I draw a stem on the bottom and say, guess where the name came from. Although some people, I guess, think of it as a highway cloverleaf. Peel off, it works really well. And when I've done drawing the paths, I'll draw a banana in the middle of that so that they have a thing to remember it by. Here's a big thing. People don't like to be embarrassed. Keep that in mind all the time. People don't like to be embarrassed. So here's the deal. You'll teach something, everything's going well. You come back the following week, and so I'm going to call those things again to see who remembers, sort of testing them. At least I used to do this. And what happens is that a few people get it right. They have that strange kind of memory, but the majority get it wrong. And you've been trying so hard to do everything you can to keep their body from going the wrong way. And here you've gone and set it up so that they're going to do it wrong. You're undoing the work that you did last week. And it's embarrassing for them, and you don't want to be embarrassed. Let me digress slightly. I used to teach square dancing, and my first wife used to come along. She unfortunately passed away 15 years ago, but she was a musician. Started out as a piano player and cellist, thankfully quickly dropped the cello, went on to teach piano, and eventually went on to teach choral stuff for kids. But when she was teaching piano, she joined a group in Princeton, New Jersey, and she would go down there once a month, and they would have group teaching, and a lot of 2 very smart guys knew an awful lot about teaching and taught the basics of it. And so the first week when she came back, she said to me, "Boy, am I going to change the way you teach square dancing." And I thought, okay. And then she taught me the principles they taught her about playing piano. And this is probably a 95% overlap, this presentation, because it made sense. Not only did it make sense, it made results. I'll get a little into more of that after. But so after you've taught something the following week, don't call it cold. It's a 4-step process, 1 week at a time. First week, you teach something. The second week, you reteach it as if nobody's ever heard of it before. And in square dancing, that has the advantages. The guy that couldn't make it last week at least gets one full teach. The third week, you still don't use it until you review it. Now, a review means, remember, this is the one that starts with facing couples and the ladies go in with their right hand. It's not a full teach, but it's a quick review to get their mind in gear. And the fourth week is really important too. Use it. Be sure you use it. Don't drop it. Don't let it fall out of their current memory bank. So teach, reteach, review, and use it again. Now I used to, and so some people just have a checklist for which calls they've done. And I ended up with a spreadsheet kind of thing saying this call was, I'd check off, you can probably do it with just 4 check marks after a thing, but you pick what you're going to teach next. The following week, you look and see what has a single check mark and you reteach it. The following week, or you see what has 2 check marks and you do a quick review. And if it's got 4 check marks, be sure to use it. I remember before learning these things, teaching a class, oh man, they're learning like mad, they're hot. These guys are smarter than I thought. So the following week I come in wholeheartedly and find out they don't know a thing, because I didn't reteach it. I thought they learned everything and they were ready to learn a whole bunch more. We had callers in the area that were convinced that you couldn't learn when it was a full moon, that when it was a full moon, the whole class would go to heck. I was convinced it was an every 4-week cycle, but not necessarily with the full moon. When I started this teach, reteach, review, and use, I didn't have any more full moons. Everybody seemed to be able, there were no off weeks because I respected what they were doing before. Now, well, we'll talk about an evening later, but in order to teach something new, reteach something you did last week, review the things you did the week before, and be sure to use that stuff all in entertaining them, gets to be a pretty packed night, but if you plan it out right, it's possible. Now, we've talked about people learn in different ways, and a lot of people have done that. Some learn by listening, some learn by seeing what's going on, demos, some learn by reading the definitions, some learn by kinesthetics, which is, by being pushed through. The body physically goes through there, and that teaches the main things about it. Unfortunately, with square dancing, well, and I think you all know that if somebody doesn't get it the first time, teaching it louder doesn't help. This goes in square dancing or anything else. Try a different approach. Maybe they're here, read this. Maybe they're a reading type of learner or what have you. When you're teaching something, I always, especially if it's a 2-couple thing, I will teach it for the heads in the middle. Then I will go out and teach it. Then I'll come back and teach it for the sides. Don't call it for the sides until you call specifically. Or let's say it's something like relay the Ducey, heads past the ocean extend. The heads are active, and we teach. So you call relay or walk them through relay the Ducey, teach it, and the heads, the active people are doing one part of the call, and the inactive people are doing a different part of the call. So before you call it for the sides being in the active part, you know, do a, you know, call swing through twice or whatever, or sides past the ocean extend, or whatever it takes to make the sides feel get the body feel of the second part, and the heads get the body feel of the first part. That even goes with grand square to some extent. The heads are doing something different than the sides. It's although not, I don't find it necessary there. And remember, if you're going to teach the heads and later you're going to teach the sides, make sure you do it in the same tip, because they may have squared up as heads this tip and sides the next tip. Just keep that in mind. Let's see, do I want to talk anything more about that? Probably, but I won't. I'll keep it short. So here's some of the main big things. Separate similar things. There are a lot of calls that have similar names. Star through, right-hand star, shoot the star. They can be confused. Right and left through, right and left grand. They can be confused. Grand right and left, grand square. Anybody else think of some that are similar names? But anyway, I can tell you're all muted. The problem is, if you've got two things that are similar, if you, let's say, star through and shoot, well, right hand star, two things that are similar, and they're in a formation that they could do either, they're going to say, that's one of the two new calls we just learned. And there's a 50-50 chance they'll get it right, and a 70-30 chance they'll get it wrong. And whatever you do, you don't want them to do it wrong. So if you separate them onto different nights, or preferably 3 nights apart, if you can squeeze that in, that'll help avoid confusion. You want them, when they've learned one of them solidly, then when you introduce the next one and they're not sure which it is, their mind is going to say one of two things. Oh, that's my old friend, and I'm going to do that. Or, oh, that's the new one we're learning, and I'm going to do that. Similarly, things that have similar actions, and this is probably even more important. You know, it starts with 2 people facing, box the gnat, star through, slide through, touch a quarter. They're too similar to be taught close to each other. Make sure they know one of them first, and then the other one, and then the other one. Slip the clutch and shoot the star. They're both ways of getting out of the R's. Too similar. Don't teach them both the same night. In fact, I used to separate them, but then I came up with even separating for getting into the R's. A way of getting out of the R's I saved for a little bit later. I do, and I gave this talk once and somebody said, that one trick made it worth coming here on the first place for the whole night. Basically, if you've got a dar, just say menu, turn back, and promenade. It's a very quick way of getting out of there, and it you don't have to confuse it by teaching 2 things compounded on each other. I'm guessing a lot of people teach shoot the star first, maybe because it's used more or what have you. I don't know. I teach slip the clutch first because there's less chance of making a mistake. There's no direction changing and all that other stuff. You just drop hands and step ahead slightly. Similar things, relay the deucey, spin chain through, spin chain the gears, spin chain and exchange the gears. They're all very similar. Do not teach them the same night. Try and separate them by 3 nights if possible. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, that's 4 times 3, that's 12 lessons right there. And then another 2 to practice the last one. Flutter wheel and reverse flutter. Teach 1, wait till they've got it. All 8 spin the top, remake the dar. There's an awful lot of similarity there. Don't mess with those together. Even grand right and left and weave the ring. People seem to have less trouble if you get confusing those, but still separate them if you can. Circulates. You don't have to teach this. In fact, you shouldn't teach the whole circulate family at the same time. Start with one. End circulate is one I usually do because it's easier to see. Then add center circulate, couple circulate, and eventually add all 8 circulate. But teach them on different weeks because they're too similar. And I'm sure you guys can think of others. Yeah, past my 5 or 10 minutes, but I thought this was going to be longer. Don't teach patterns. You know, lead to the right, circle to a line is not a call. It's 2 calls. Teach lead to the right and do other stuff first. And I guess lead to the right, veer left is becoming a call too. Teach other things. You can teach circle to a line separately. Ocean waves, recycle, and circle to a line, but that's really pushing it. I would teach lead to the right separately, and once they've got that, then add the circle to a line after it. Centers in and cast off 3/4. That's not 1 call, it's 2. Flutter wheel and sweep a quarter. I have a little story about that. Local caller once asked me to fill in for his class because he had to be away, and I said, sure. What did you teach last week? Oh, and he said, I'll give you a full list of the things that they know. And I said, what specifically did you teach last week? Because I wanted to reteach those, whether he did or not. At least they'd learned some of them correctly. And he said, well, I taught flutter wheel and sweep a quarter. They go together really well, so I taught them together. Taught them both. When I went in, I just taught flutter wheel. One of the dancers came up to me and said, oh, that's where it ends. It's, you know, don't teach patterns, teach the individual calls. Sweep a quarter is cool because it's one of the first concepts we do. If you're getting into challenge, you do tons of concepts, but sweep a quarter is a concept. The direction of it is dependent on the previous call. Swing through, spin the top right and left through is not a call. It's 3 calls, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, teach the individual calls. This is something that a lot of people have different opinions on. Whether you should teach by definitions the full thing right away, every position, or whether not. Some calls I find that I can teach every which way, and it helps the definition fall into their heads. I'm thinking acey-deucey. But other calls, they're more difficult some ways than others, like relay the deucey half sashayed. I will teach the one method that's used most frequently, and later on, if we have time, and depending on what this club typically dances, I will add the other variation. Now, here's something I work very hard at. When I teach a call, I use, what am I trying to say? I use generic terms that meet the definition, so that if somebody goes on to dance advanced or challenge, they don't have to undo what I taught them and relearn a new definition. For instance, on recycle, I teach the centers fold behind the ends. I don't say the girls fold behind the guys, because it's the centers, whoever they happen to be. I only do it with the women for a long time because because that's a little more confusing to do both of those. But at least I use the wording so they don't have to unlearn something later. Use words that include DBD, that's what I just said. Also, if you're gonna call to this group regularly, you know that there's some variations you use a lot and some variations you just don't use. I know people that, oh, I teach square through with 4 men and then with 4 women and what have you. And then half sashayed couples, 1 couple half sashayed, 1 normal. These guys, frequently, the only way they ever call it is facing normal couples. So why waste time teaching it the other way? As long as your words are adequate so that they can extend it if they have to when they get experienced. But if you aren't going to use it, don't bother teaching it. If it's part of your regular calling repertoire, go for it. But if it's not, they got enough to learn. Now, when I teach, I like to teach formations really early. I like to make sure they're comfortable with 8-chain through formation, with facing lines, with ocean waves as soon as I can. And once they're comfortable with those basic formations, then I can teach any calls I want. If I have an ocean wave, they're comfortable with ocean waves, I can teach centers trade, or I can teach spin chain the gears, because they're familiar with that formation and comfortable with it. And it also helps, and if you talk to a lot of people about what makes calls easy and what makes calls difficult, or sequences difficult, it has a lot to do with formation awareness, you know, knowing more than just your part, but where the rest of the square is and how you fit in. Somebody says centers trade, you've got to know whether you're a center or an it. That's kind of an obvious one, but there are others. So this starts to build a little bit of formation awareness. One of the things people tend to do, even on party nights, is teach couple number 1, couple number 2, couple number, but they never use it, or they might, but why waste time learning the difference between couple 1 and 2? I just teach heads or sides, heads and sides, not or, and just use heads and sides. And before they're about to go out and talk to the real world, then I'll add the fact of why we number you individually. It used to be for more non-symmetric things, but if you encounter another caller instead of heads, he'll probably say couples number 1 and 3, or couples number 2 and 4. But teach, you know, you don't have to teach the numbers. They need to know heads, they need to know sides, and the less they need to know to get into whatever formations and such, the better at the beginning. Excuse me while I sip here. All right. And I like to, in order to get them into formations and comfortable with that, there are a number of building blocks that I use. Right and left through, ladies chain, star through is very important to me. Pass through, bend the line, eventually step to a wave, and that kind of stuff. But you can do an awful lot of getting into different formations. I believe these are the only calls. They're the only ones that came to mind late last night. But just to move people around, could have dive through, pass through. But anyway, you don't have to teach that many calls to get them moving through these different formations, and to work early to get formations so that you can go on and teach any call you think is appropriate for the teaching order that we will be talking about very soon. I was going to add something to that, but I guess I won't. There's certain calls that I think of as precise and others that I think of as sloppy. Circle left is a sloppy call. Where does it end? I didn't put it on the list. Right hand and left hand stars are sloppy calls. Where do they start? Where do they end? Goal posting I had from a previous presentation. I saved that for much later, but I don't think of it quite as sloppy as the others, but it's still, you know, and come into separate around 1 and come into the middle tends to make a mess of squares. One of the things, this is a personal thing because I guess I just can't teach stars very well. An awful lot of people use and rely on right-hand stars, left-hand stars for party nights, lesson 1, lesson 2 nights. I find that a right-hand star or a left-hand star ends when the caller tells you to end it. Make a star till you get to the corner, do a right and left through. And if you want to tell them, if you want your timing to be right so they get that message right in time, all squares have to be moving at the same rate, the same speed. And you take beginners and you call heads make a right-hand star, and that square is going to start, and eventually that one will, and maybe another one will finally figure out which the right hand is, and oh, it's the star. So beginners don't respond and react instantly in the same way. And if you can't get a star started the same place, how can you time it? Like This square, do a right and left through with your corner. Now this square, do a right and left through with your corner. Now this one, so I find it really easy just to stay away from them. When I was teaching tech squares, 0 to plus, I would teach stars the last night. 0 to plus in 13 weeks. I forgot the key factor there. And they already knew stars because we'd use them in some sort with spin chain the gears and that kind of thing. But basically what I taught them is the sequence you're going to run into in singing calls. Heads make a right-hand star, meet the sides, make a left-hand star, or heads square through, make a right-hand star, come back to the middle with a left-hand star. Going from one hand to the other in one location to another is something that needed a little pre-warning. But again, those are calls that I find they're not a building block. They don't get me to different formations. They aren't going to accomplish what I want. Oh, and here's a biggie. That's why I put it in bold and italics. Teach harder calls early. A lot of people will save the harder calls to the end of the series. A lot of very experienced callers will teach in the order that they learned, which was they learned some calls and then another one was invented, so they add that to the list. And then another one was invented, so they add that to their list of teaching. But the harder calls, if you can get them in early, they're going to have a lot more practice doing them before the end of the series of lessons, so that when somebody calls relay the deucey when they go out to dance, they will have had 5, 10 weeks, 15 weeks of practice of doing it, and it should come fairly easily. If you save it to the last night or the night before the last, they're not going to have a full teaching reviewing sequence on it, and they're going to mess up when they got out. Teach harder calls early, if possible. And this goes back to why I teach formations early, so that once I've got them comfortably going through the different formations with my building blocks, then I can teach any call I want. If I want to teach spin chain the gears, I can do that fairly early in my series. Now, I'm talking about teaching plus calls. Same goes for mainstream, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. One of the things that we'll work at in a second here, and I've given separate talks that overlap this about 80%, on creating a good teaching order. Caller Lab has published a teaching order. They say it's suggested, and I've talked for years and given up finally. I say some people think suggested means dictated, must be, has to be done, where others say this is suggested only. If you're having troubles coming up with your own, this one will probably work for you. I noticed that when Betsy Gata did her talk, she also did a good job of distinguishing that suggested doesn't mean it's a law. And it turns out that Caller Lab's teaching order doesn't agree with what I would teach, but it is better than it used to be. They've been making improvements all along. Now, to me, a good teaching order depends on several things. One is, what's your destination program? If I'm teaching a club that dances mainstream, my destination program is mainstream, and I want to teach callers the dancers mainstream. But if my club is dancing plus, that's my destination program, I'm going to teach an integrated list of both plus and mainstream. There's no reason that the plus calls have to be saved for the end. In fact, most of the plus calls are more difficult. That's why they're moved up to another list. So I'm going to teach those as early as I can so they have as much practice time on it. One of the things I didn't mention earlier, but when you're trying to set up a lesson plan, a teaching sequence, you don't want to teach two of the more difficult calls. Some calls are real difficult, some are real easy. You don't want to teach more than one difficult call the same evening if you can separate them. So if I'm following all the principles that I just stated, and I have 10 lessons to teach them in, or 50 lessons to teach them in, for me to separate, I'm not presenting this right. Let me try again. Let's say that the teaching order that somebody's published for you says do this, 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 oh, a hard one, this, 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 oh, a hard one, and every fourth one is a difficult one. Well, if you're teaching 4 calls a night, that works. If you're teaching 5 calls a night, because you don't have as many lessons allotted to you, then they're going to end up with 2 hard calls that night. So your teaching order depends on the destination program, on the number of lessons, and on the number, which leads to the number of calls per lesson. I hope that makes sense to people. Anyway, if it doesn't, I give up and let's move on. Again, I just talked about teaching an integrated list. If the destination is plus, teach the mainstream and plus calls all together so that you can get the hard ones separated, the hard ones as much teaching time as possible. I'm repeating myself. That's called reviewing, reteaching. Anyway, so what are the goals of teaching? 1 is we want to entertain dancers. 2 is we want to get dancers ready for local dancers, whether mainstream, plus, or what have you. I know that in our area, people always used to, when the class finally graduated and they were taking them out to their first club dance at a different location, they went with them and they built a wall around them to protect them because they had to be treated with kid gloves. And some of my groups, I would send them out and say, don't be bored by the way people did it, because they were ready. They could handle pretty much what was thrown at them. At this point, I've got some hints on specific calls, but I guess we'll hear a consensus. And what are you hearing, or what have you, Dan? This is a good stop point, except for my summarizing, or I can go into a few slides of those specific calls that I personally have found easy ways to teach. Any consensus? Hands up, hands down, thumbs down. I see a screen with 10 people on it.
The only thing that's been happening in the chat that I see is Mel didn't get the time change, and so he has just joined. So one of the things I would note on teaching order is that I have been using, I've gone totally off the rails now that I actually kind of have a feel for calling more than I used to. But I've been using Rich Reel's teaching order largely because he provided material where Caller Lab didn't. And so I had a full curriculum when I was a newer caller that got me there. And so, at the time I was so overwhelmed by everything that I didn't have what's a hard call? What's an easy call? I don't know. But hey, look, here's singing call figures all the way through. I'm going to use this in teaching order. So I would suggest that anybody who has a teaching order that they want to be adopted, provide a good list of singing call figures that callers who want to do this kind of thing can actually use right off the shelf.
That's one of the reasons I teach from the order I have. It's different than what you were saying, but I would like for you to go through the rest of the slides, because my questions and comments will probably lead off on a rabbit trail that could be pretty extensive.
Okay, I don't have too much more, and as I say, on specific calls and the things that I found useful, they're not necessarily great. But scoot back, people for years had said, don't use the same hand twice. And we finally have figured out that what you really mean is don't use a hand if it's not available. After a square through 4, your left hand is not available because it's still reaching way back for letting go of the person in front of you. But after a from an Allemande when you slip the clutch, you've just used your left hand, and you can do an Allemande left right after it using the left hand twice because it's available. Scoot back is another example. It uses the same hand 3 times. It uses start with the right, to right by the right in the middle, and come back to the right. One hint to help people, so they, if you've got them trained to blindly move ahead and alternate hands, is have them put their left hand behind them on this, learning this particular call. Just a quick thing that might help. I like to teach, again, for mainstream, it's spin chain through. For plus mainstream combined, to be spin chain the gears. But I teach that before spin the top, and that must drive some people crazy. But I find that that 3/4 turn that the centers of a spin the top or any of these other calls have is a difficult concept. You know, just how far do you go? And so on a spin chain through, a spin chain the gears, the centers trade and go a little bit more till the very centers hook in a wave across the center. And that's where the 3/4 ends. And that gets them used to doing that 3/4 turn. Then you can adapt it to the square through afterwards. I mean, the spin the top or fan the top. You know, I used to teach fan the top first before spin the top, and it was just totally disorienting. I like to use dive through before California twirl. Some people say, how can you do that? You need a California twirl for it. But I like to teach, you know, the centers make an arch, the others duck through, the centers step forward over them, drop hands if you have to, make a virtual arch so you don't knock hairdos off. And the center, those in the center are ready to do the next call. Those that are facing out, I'm going to have you not be stranded out there. I want you, the guys, to walk around the girls turn under the arch and face back in. They know the ending formation because it's facing back into the center of the square. They don't have to know that it's a California twirl. Many weeks later, I'll have lines of 4 pass through, grab your partner's hand, make an arch, make believe somebody just did a dive through, and do that twirly thing to get back in. And we give that particular move a name, and it's called California twirl. But teaching dive through first gives them an orientation where that California twirl ends. You know, head star through California twirl. The California twirl by itself just ends all over the place depending on where you start. And part of the success of a call is knowing where you're supposed to end. All right, that was about it on, on specifics. But let's go, just review the main points. Make sure they do it right the first time. Don't test them the second time. Do a 4-step process. Teach, reteach, review, and be sure to use it after that. And again, if you're not going to use 4 men square through a lot, don't bother using it. Don't bother teaching that. Make the words general enough. You know, the men, don't say men turn right, women turn left after the first pull by. But just, actually, let me go back here. But make sure that it's general enough so when you do have it or they come across somebody else that they can't say, well, my taller told me this. I do have one more teaching hint that somebody told me many years ago and works for me. A lot of people have troubles with teaching square through because dancers do courtesy turns after, and that's why they like to use 4 men or what have you. I teach square through one hand. It's a right hand pull by. I use it from a double pass through to an Allemande left. I tell them, I might even say it's a little dumb, but we're going to build on it later. But I get it. 1 is it starts with facing couples. 2 is it starts with the right hand. And 3, the main thing you want to teach is that it's a walk straight by after the last hand. And it works out that way with the square through one hand. They don't have much choice. 2 or 3 weeks later, as long as I can do it, I'll say, now we can square through 2 hands if you want. You're going to give 1 hand pull by, now turn to the person next to you, use the other hand and left hand and walk straight by them. And this tends to emphasize the walking straight by. And 3 weeks later, I'll teach square through 3 hands, and I'll say, actually, you can square through 15 hands while I go get coffee. Speaking of which, excuse me. But the default is 4. If I say square through and don't give you a number of hands, it's square through 4 hands. And then I'll use 4 a lot and 3 to the corner, etc. But the main, I never have problems with courtesy turns because I have that walk straight by thing after. Yeah. All right, where were we here? Don't test them on the second night of a call. Teach, reteach, review, and be sure to use. Separate similar things that have similar names. Let them learn one thoroughly before the other. Separate similar actions. Let them learn one before they learn the other. Teach harder calls as early as possible so they have plenty of practice time before they get out to the world. Leave it. There's certain calls that you can, when I set up a teaching order, I find what's the next, I need to review what I did last time. I need to throw in a hard call this time because there are enough hard calls that I only want one a night. And then there are a bunch of filler calls that I use that are easy teaches and don't confuse any of the other things. Some of the easy calls are the building blocks I use really early to get me into different formations. But some of the less frequently used calls, I might save to the very end to use filler calls later on. For instance, on a teacup chain, if a dancer screws up on that, they're only going to screw up on one call, one sequence. If they screw up on a swing through, they're going to mess up the whole sequence. So I like the ones that I will put off to later are ones that if you screw up, it's not quite as embarrassing and ruining the whole sequence. I'm not sure if that totally makes sense, but there are a lot of calls, like I say, right-hand stars I leave to the end. Spinching through isn't used that often these days. I'll teach it early if I'm teaching mainstream only because I need that 3/4 turn ending. But otherwise, if I'm teaching a combined thing, I'll teach spin chain the gears well before that and leave that closer to the end. And sometimes I'll teach, and while you're doing that, let's have the end circulate once. It's teaching a sequence, but it's done a lot. And the main point, entertain them, and you should have fun. Because if you're having fun, they're having fun. And I think that's about it. So let me see if I can figure out how to unshare. Oh, push escape.
There we
Unshare.
go. So in the back channel, Cece asked if you have a published thing on your teaching order anywhere.
Well, again, I don't, because the teaching order depends on how many lessons your club says you need to teach. If you can't govern it yourself, but a club says we are going to graduate on this day, teach them by then. And having taught at Tech Squares where they used to tell me 10 weeks and I convinced them to go 13, is different than a 25-week class or a 40-week class. And so that governs how many calls you call that each lesson. So how far apart you have to have the harder calls. I do have a handout that I have given. I didn't look at, but I will make available for this talk. That's got a little bit more detail than just the keynote presentation. And I believe I've given a parallel talk on how to create a good teaching order, and I do have a handout on that, and I can figure out how to make those available, if that answers your question.
And the other thing, John commented that he really liked the whiteboard idea, and I've got a new caller who comes down to, well, back when we were dancing, came down to my Thursday night classes, And he's also interesting because he's in a wheelchair, so it's fun to have him dance with the
Yeah.
the crowd. But he, for his own purposes, has been building diagrams of things, and he'll bring down the diagrams that he's drawn up, and the dancers love them. So I think I need to start dragging a whiteboard to my my event.
When you can, it makes, diamonds is another one that some people just don't see why the heck it's called diamond. And it, you draw the four dancers, and then you draw a diamond shape in between them, and it really helps some people remember it. Again, people have different learning styles, and one of the learning styles in general, as I said before, is not just say it louder.
And I also liked your so actually two other things. One is that the caller I learned from liked to repeat the definition but louder. So I got into the habit of not using the Caller Lab definitions when I taught. And then Harlan Kerr pointed out that, people spend an awful lot of time making those concise and specific, and actually using the Caller Lab definitions isn't a bad thing. Just don't repeat it louder. The other is I really like your idea of spin chain through early on, because that's kind of the first call that introduces diamonds. As not explicitly, but it's the first thing that puts them in that position.
Yeah.
And it's always taught. I love the call because it's one of the magic three that moves one person from one side to the other. And it's always under taught. So thank you for that.
When Clark Baker started working on definitions, we talked a lot about it, and I've always thought that there are two sets of things you should have. One is a full definition that describes it in total detail, that covers every possible situation, which is pretty much what they're doing. And two is to have it's something that's more of a teaching aid than a definition. In other words, as I said, you don't have to teach every form right away. Keep the word general enough, but there should be more of a teaching guide kind of thing. And I think they've added a few hints on teaching in there. I haven't looked at it in a while.
In the Caller Lab definitions, it actually says that the written definitions are for dancers and callers. And callers that are teaching, the definitions are written to explain the technicalities, but you need to find your own words to explain it to the dancers. So that's written right in the definitions.
Yeah, I guess I had a little bit of influence on Clark anyway. But yeah, they're totally, not totally different, but you shouldn't just stand there and read the definition to the dancers, because that doesn't do any good.
John, I've got a couple questions. You may have covered this, so I'll leave it till the end, just in case. I didn't know if you may or may not have covered this. So if anybody else has got any questions, then I'll just run through these so I don't look like a total idiot.
I just wanted to bring up a couple of things. One of the things was I noticed one day while I was dancing at a festival, and Steve Kopman was calling, and he was talking. He had us in some weird offset thing like he does, and he was talking about how to square through there, and he was saying, "You're going to stay in your group. You're going to stay in your group of four. You're going to stay in your group," and he kept using the word group. So I wanted to point out that language matters, because I had to think about it later, and I thought, why does he keep saying group? It's a box of four. Why doesn't he just say box of four? And I realized that the word group has some inherent meaning to it, because when you're in a group like we are right now, you don't leave the group. You don't let anybody else. You don't separate. You don't leave the group. You stay in your group. You enjoy your own group, and that kind of I think helped a lot of dancers, because a lot of them think box. What's a box? I don't know. They don't know what a box of four is. So you tell them to stay in your group of four, and it really emphasized and drove that point home. And another thing that
was a good point, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Use language that the dancers understand, not language that we understand.
Exactly. And the other thing was, I like to, because, you know, one of our jobs as teachers is to teach them to be able to go and dance to anybody.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I like to do is, well, I don't really like doing it, but I do it anyway, is I tell them, you know, things that they might hear other callers do. You know, like I don't use couple numbers. I use heads and sides, and that's
Good.
words that come out of my mouth. I don't use couple numbers at all, but some other callers use couples 1 and 3 and couples 2 and 4, or, you know, the evens and odds. That's always fun. So, you know, I'll use that occasionally, but the real thing that I wanted to, you know, mention is, for example, when I teach circle to align, and I use the words circle to align because that is the name of the call, and this is a pet peeve that I picked up from Tim Mariner back in the day. He always said that it drove him nuts because the call is circle to align and you rarely actually hear the name of the call. So I like to emphasize to the dancers, after I finish teaching circle to align and I drive it into their head that the name of the call is circle to align, then I take them back home and I go, now here's what you're going to hear some other callers say. And I throw the Southern accent on just for fun. Well, the heads lead right and you circle up forward and you bust them out and you make a line up to the middle and you come on back. And they go, and I go, now if you hear a caller say that, here's what they mean. They mean lead right, circle to align. That's it. All right. So ignore all that other mess and just do the circle to align. Now I tell them that, and then I go, I'm not going to be saying that. And if you hear another caller say it, you have my permission to go smack them. Of course, lightens the mood, and then everybody goes, okay, all right. So by the way, if you say that and you're calling to one of my dancers, watch yourself. That's all I got.
Daryl, what were you going to say? I thought you.
Is there another Daryl somewhere?
No, you're the Daryl that I saw a yellow line around, which meant that you'd made a noise, so the Zoom thought you were talking.
I think Mel was trying to say something.
Well, that's true, John. Daryl, you got to wait. Wave your hand. Go back to sleep. Mel, what was on your mind? I didn't mean it literally, Daryl. Don't go away.
I'm closing the door in case Yvonne starts rattling around in the kitchen and puts a yellow fox.
Blame the wife. You're a brave man, Daryl.
It's still in bed. I said in case. I didn't know it was going to be sensitive.
A couple of things. I don't know if you've raised these. One, I definitely do like the fact that you said note the teaching level is per the regional area or for your club, because teaching order, club order, there's a massive argument going on. Well, I teach basic through plus as one level. I teach whatever as one level. A lot of that is not governed by the callers. A lot of that is governed by the contract. So I'm really glad you said that. One thing I'd like to really stress on that is don't lie to your dancers about their dancing ability. So if you've got one of those classes that teaches basic through plus in 12 weeks because that's what your regional club or the people that hired you wanted to do, don't lie to them. Say you can go and dance plus everywhere. Or if you're doing a mainstream class and you've just finished the basics but you're teaching mainstream, don't tell them that they're mainstream dancers. They're square dancers, but tell them they're learning the mainstream program. You won't be able to dance. One of the biggest things that I see at a lot of these larger dances is there's a lot of callers will bring their newer dancers to the dance or encourage them to go to the festival. You know, we're going to go to Don Beck's Plus Weekend to see what it's all about, and you're brand new dancers. And of course they go there to sit. That just creates the we're better than you mystique. And a lot of dancers drop out that way. Second was relate your level of teaching to the other classes in your region. That's particularly important for teaching order. I'm really glad that you encourage your dancers to go and dance with other callers and at other clubs. But if, let's say, Daryl Clendenin and I are calling in an area and we both got a class going, I would love to go and visit Daryl's class. He'd probably like to have his dancers come and visit my class. So we're going to communicate and say, right, we'd like to have a visit at such and such a time. Where do you anticipate you would be, so that our dancers could all interact? I found that most areas or most regions have a relative teaching order that is pretty close to everybody else in their region. There are differences, so you just have to be aware of that.
Mel, can I interrupt on that? Because
Absolutely.
when I've given the talk locally to our Callers Association, either on hinting at teaching order because of teaching about teaching, or just specifically about teaching order, they say, well, if you teach that, your people can't come to our class level dances. And because we've been going, you know, all the other 10 callers in the area have been going by the Caller Lab list. And my comment, well, my snarky comment is, well, if you all learned my list, used my list, then we could all go to this at the same time. But in reality, yes, going to hear other callers and going to learn about the sociability with mixing with other dancers in the area is really important. But to me, it's not as important as my class being able to integrate into my club and dance well, and integrate into the other clubs and dance well at the end of the season. I would, if others won't abide by my teaching order, I will, what was I trying to say? I will sacrifice that so that they can be good dancers and not just have a lot of fun one year, but have a lot of fun for many years.
That's essentially what I'm saying. If you have a group that learns basic through mainstream in 12 weeks or basic through plus in 30 weeks, once they finish that level, they can pretty much go, and I know the way you teach, they can pretty much go to any mainstream or any plus dance and dance. If there's a teaching order that goes, it follows both ways. You can always dance a lower program. You can't dance a higher program. And this is why I say don't lie to your dancers about if you are doing a modified teaching order, make sure that if they're going to go somewhere and dance, or they come to your dance and you have visitors, you'll modify your program for your visitors. Suddenly they're going to go to another club and they're going to get calls they've never heard of and all this other kind of stuff. And that's what I mean by don't lie to your dancers. I think somebody said have a board or a tick list of the movements at the program level.
I see you, Daryl. One of the things I found and then lost in my mind. When I used to be hired to do class level balls, there'd be dancers from 5, 6, 7 clubs there, not including my own. And I found that without knowing what their lists were, I could call a basic enough dance to keep them all entertained. And every once in a while, I might hit a call that I thought they would know, but they don't. And somebody say, "Oh, teach us that." And I'll say, "No, I'll just avoid it. It's easy to avoid. And I want you to be taught by your caller when he gets around to it." Mel, before you finish your list, before you finish your list, Daryl's been poking his hand in the air and he doesn't know enough to speak up and interrupt. I'm picking on you, Daryl. Daryl and I have known each other for a long, long time, and we can pick on each other. We frequently do.
I was going to say that I'm fairly new at this, but I do live in a metropolitan area. We don't have as many clubs as we used to, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of difference in what I'm about to say. In this area, and I think it probably applies to a good many areas where you have multiple clubs, if we're going to have a new dancer dance, it's usually advertised at a Caller Lab level. It'll be maybe 10 lesson level movements 1 through anywhere from 20 to 30 to 40 to 50. And usually they do a class level dance at about basic level. And everybody knows what it is. So regardless of the how you integrate the movements, your teaching program, you know that you have a destination as you're going through that's going to match everything in the area. And that's the big thing. I don't think anybody teaches everything in the same rotation. I'm certain I don't. You were talking earlier about teaching square through. I teach it the first night, but that's just weird. You know, it's just what I do. But no,
Weird is good.
you know,
No, I'm in complete agreement. The reason I brought it up is I used to teach in Europe. I taught in Canada. I taught over here, and whenever we have a dance, I use the ECTA, the European Callers and Teachers Association, as an example. They do an annual freshman's frolic, but they encourage a lot of visitors. So whenever it happens, the callers that are employed or engaged to call those dances always get together with all the local clubs and do exactly what you're saying, Daryl. If they're following the Caller Lab list, it could be basic 1 through 20, that'll be it, or they'll actually say what movements they all do so that all the dancers have a good time. And Dawn, absolutely correct. That was another one off my tick list. If you're going to visit other clubs, don't teach a movement. That's up to their club callers. Just avoid it. So you've got that one ticked off my list. I don't know if you covered this. I said interchange the general terms. I heard you mention it at the end. That's when you're teaching the movements: boys, girls, centers, ends, heads, sides, couples 1 and 4, or sorry, couples 1 and 3, 2 and 4. Use that general in terms mix and match. And I'm pretty sure Jeremy was touching on the same thing. Don't just teach boys, girls, etc. Boys, scoot back; girls, scoot back; centers, zoom. Those are catchwords that you hear over and over that need to be avoided.
I think you need to do leaders and trailers too. That's a big one.
Yeah, general terms. A tick list for dancers. I don't know if you covered it. I like to give my dancers not only a list of what the movements are so they can follow it off on their own tick box, but I give them the materials as well. Those that want to read ahead, do read ahead. Those that want to look at the definitions, look at the definitions. That doesn't change how I teach them. It's just, as you said, I think you probably, I don't know if you covered learning styles in general terms in this. If you did, I can just leave that one alone.
Not very briefly, because that wasn't the point I was pushing.
Yeah. Building blocks. Now, you mentioned stars. I think it's the same thing you were talking about. You teach head square through 1. I'll just use the star as an example. You've got the home boy star right, girl star right, boy star left, girl star left. Then you got head star right, head star left, back home, head star right to the corner, all that, those other kinds of things. Do you build them progressively like that as you teach through that, or do you try and teach a movement in a night and do the family of movements?
As I said earlier, if a call is easy to teach in every position, I use AC-doocy as an example, then I go for it. If a call feels different from here than it does there, if it's a lot of complicated to do it enough from a right-hand way with men on the end, I won't teach the right-hand way with the women on the end until later, but I'll leave my definition broad enough so that I'll say, well, now that we know this, by the way, there's another way we can still do that with the same definition. We can let's look at it from here, and I reteach it from there because it feels different.
Yeah. The other one was, you mentioned group. I'm
Sure.
a very, very strong believer in teaching the square dance terminology in basic terms to the dancers while I'm teaching them, such as box, line, wave, column, as a point of reference, because that's what is used on the floor. You know, make a line, or if the square breaks down, to align lines up to the middle and back as a reference of dancers so that they know the baseline of the formations. What's your opinion on introducing the terminology of formation awareness to the dancers while they're learning?
I personally think that it depends on how close the terminology is to the English language, how often it's likely to be used. I don't think box is something that makes sense to the dancers. I think lines is something that makes sense to the dancers. Introduce it later, but don't sort of start with it. I like what Jeremy was saying that Steve Kottman did about in your group of 4, do this. because they can picture what that is. Now, group is not a standard term, but it's understood. And
Yeah, I'll typically, I'll tell them that it's a box. I'll tell them that they're in a box of four, but we're calling it a group. And mainly, what I was kind of getting at with that is, if you're calling to a group of dancers that aren't your own, I would assume that they don't know that terminology. So when you're calling to a different group, is different than when you're calling to your own group. Because what your dancers know, obviously, and when you're calling to a festival floor like he was, using those basic English words is useful. Of course, that's not going to help you if you're in Europe, but
that was actually the point of the comment. I have a friend of mine in Japan that translates a lot of the caller material, a lot of the articles that are written in various magazines for her own local callers association. And I know Europe was very, very stringent on this at one time, but the terminology that was used was very, very specific to the caller lab list, the caller lab teaching, or the caller lab definitions and the caller lab reference, so that everybody was going from the same reference. And they found that important because when you had a visiting American caller or a visiting Australian caller or something to Europe, they were at least familiar with that terminology. And they would use things like a line or a box or a wave. If they were doing a split circulate, it's when they would say on your own side, in your own group of four, on your own side of the wave, or introduce that in your own box of four on your own side. Make sure that that's taught when they're teaching the movements, mainly because of the language barriers across the globe. It just makes a good standard reference. So if you are going to vary, and I think that's where you're getting at, Jeremy, if you are going to vary it, or if local callers have something in their area, such as circle up four, break that out and do a curly cue, from that old San Antonio stroll or whatever it was, then you definitely do have to make them aware of what is being used in your area. You may not use it, but familiarize it, but do that after the fact.
what I try to do, and I think I've said this in the whole teaching bit, is, or I implied it, I didn't say it, but I try to teach as little unnecessary stuff as possible.
Yeah.
I want them dancing. I want them moving. I want them learning to respond to what the caller says and which words he says that are important. I don't want him responding to his corner, pushing him or her. So that's one of the reasons I only teach heads and sides, and I leave off a couple numbers till later on.
Yeah. It's not a matter of when, it's a matter of, I know you specifically, you do that. There was one other, which was, no, pass. I've got another question for you, but it's related to a different matter.
Well, I just, while you were
I have a
talking about,
question.
go ahead.
Well, I kind of come in late this morning because it's a little bit early for me here, but one of the things, I don't know if you brought it up, some of the other stuff that I try to teach is I teach my dancers what a right-hand wave really is, or how to make lines if they do break down, because a lot of people, you say make lines, but they don't know how to do it.
I know a lot of people teach that. I personally, when I see more than a few squares broken down, or even one, depending on the size of the group, try and get them home as soon as I can and get everybody dancing again together.
Well, there is an official way to actually get everybody home. I mean, to get everybody into lines, and that is if everybody goes home.
I teach that.
Okay.
There is, Janet, but it just,
I teach that.
Again, I don't teach it because I find that then they're busy scurrying, trying to do that, and not listening to me. And whereas I'm busy, by that time I've gotten them back resolved. And
So you don't teach that in lessons when you're teaching them, when a square breaks down, you don't teach them how to correctly get back into lines?
No, I tell them to go back and square their sets personally, because I can resolve everybody else real quickly enough to bring them back on board that way. It's just the way I choose to do it.
But the idea is that not every caller can do that. So if they're out dancing to somebody else and their square breaks down and they don't know how to correctly get back into lines effectively and efficiently, then you've told them to go home and the other caller doesn't know how to get them home very quickly, then they're stuck there because they weren't taught how to get back in lines correctly.
That is an excellent point.
Yeah, it is a double-edged sword as well. I'm partially with you on that, Don. I don't teach get home make lines early. I do teach it, but a little bit later on, because I found that dancers are insecure at the beginning. They're more comfortable getting home to a square. Once they got enough meat in the program that lines are a common situation, then I'll teach it. And that's long after they realize that, hey, you know, you're not always going to end up with the same partner. You're not always going to end up with this. You can keep dancing. You can fix it at the end. It's a lot easier to wait a bit until they're comfortable. But that's just the way I do it.
I agree with what you're saying, that it would be, that it's one of those things that I teach, if I'm going to teach it, and it sounds like it's a really good idea that I should, that I would teach it closer to the end of the lessons, because it's nothing that's part of
Oh
the
yeah, I
model.
do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did want to throw in a comment when Mel was, this is a little anecdote which I may have mentioned in previous sessions, but when Mel was talking about the language barriers, one time calling in the Czech Republic, I called Men Run and the whole floor stopped. And it was in a normal, pretty even formation. And finally somebody whispered, Boys Run. And then that whisper sort of spread through the hall. Everybody did it. And from then on, they had all learned a new term. Whenever I called Men Run, it meant Boys Run, and everything was fine. But just little bit language barrier things. Let me point out that it is 16 after the hour. We are officially done, and we can still hang around and talk because the conversation seems to be going well. But let me thank our technician and MC, Dan Like. Let me thank our presenter, me. Let me thank mostly you guys for hanging in there and listening and contributing at the end, and for tolerating me talking as long as I did. But it was a topic that I wanted to go through a lot of points on. We're officially done, but please hang on there. Go ahead, anybody else?
I'm going to leave the recording running for a moment, but
I have a question. Can you make the slides available?
I said before, I have a handout that I usually give with this. That's not only the slides, but it's just a little more detail in there, and I think that's a better thing I will try to make available. I have a similar handout that overlaps about 90% on how to create a teaching order that I use. Normally, as I think I said, this is the first time I've used a PowerPoint-ish presentation. Unlike, and I was going to refer this to Mel as far as giving material out early. When I give a talk, I prefer not to give handouts at the beginning, because people start reading ahead and not paying attention to what's going on. And I'll hand them out at the end and let them know that, you know, you don't have to take notes. The high points are reminded in this handout. Right now, I just want you to pay attention to me. So there's pros and cons. You know, you do have fast learners that do want to jump ahead, and maybe you could talk to them on the side and say, here, take this, but be sure to listen to me anyway. But I personally, and that's one of the reasons I don't like PowerPoint presentations, because sometimes people just put up a big list of things and just they read them. And I had a talk to give, not just reading these, and I tried to abbreviate the comments and put them up one at a time, adding a different thing as I went, so you wouldn't be reading ahead but listening and talking about the point we have. Just a presentation type of thought. And Jeremy, I've noticed some of your presenters in class put long lists up and then go through them one at a time and hope you don't read ahead, and then others nicely reveal the next point when
I definitely agree with that. I saw a really funny cartoon one time, and it was basically, and now for my presentation, I'm going to read you my PowerPoint. And No, thanks. So if you watch my video, you'll notice that I kind of did the same thing you did, and point by point, and then talking in more detail.
I watched it, but I can't remember specifically who did it, who inspired me and who didn't. By the way, if anybody's interested, maybe I can find it. There was a talk that somebody put out on, I don't know, posted somewhere that I happened to look at. And it was a class at MIT where a lecturer was talking about how to give presentations. And I listened to it in pieces. I didn't want to sit through the whole hour at a time, but it was fascinating. This guy was kind of a boring presenter and just talk and talk, but his points were so good. And he said, and there's this point and there's this point, and you noticed I was just using this to get through to you. And it was a great presentation. And one of the things was the PowerPoint, you don't go tons at a time, what have you. If anybody's interested in that particular talk, email me, donbeck@donbeck.org, and I will try to locate that, because I'm sure I saved the URL. It was, for those that like to do or have to do presentations, it was pretty entertaining seeing this guy, even though he got laughs out of the class once in a while, but he was pretty, he wasn't animated like some people are, but he sure got his point across and did well. Also, if you're interested in the 2 handouts for this presentation and another one, email me at donbeck@donbeck.org, and I will send those out to you. I haven't figured out how to post things places yet. Daryl, you were raising your hand again.
Yes, I was. As a matter of fact, 2 or 3 different times there. Believe it or not, I had an answer, or at least a question, for the young lady that asked about making lines if squares break down. Especially in a class, I'd say no, not a good idea. The reason for that is alum and left. The only way the dancers, especially new dancers, know that they've done things right is to get to the right corner and be able to promenade home. That's the win, isn't it? That's the win. To me, even at a regular dance, expecting the dancers to save the caller so he doesn't have to get to an alum and left is silly. I mean, how you should be prepared and not be so far away from an alum and left, which you never are very far away from it anyway, if you can recognize it. But it just puts the onus on the dancers to let the caller go on and on and on and on. No reason for that.
Daryl, sorry to interrupt, but that's an interesting point. I've seen dancers will make lines and dance, which is good. The meat of it is the dancing. But when they don't get their original corner and their original partner at the end, they get totally confused. I did everything right. They don't get that reward.
Well,
they know when they've broken down. I'm sorry, hon. Give me half a second here. When they've broken down, don't make them just keep going so the caller can keep going through material. It just doesn't make any. If you're reading stuff, keep the stuff short enough that you can get there. If it's memorized, keep it short enough that you can get there. If you're doing mental image, keep it short. Whatever. Take the responsibility of getting back to that corner and picking up the whole floor all at once and giving them a chance to win, which is alum and left. Okay, honey, I'm done. Go ahead.
Well, what I'm doing is I'm looking at it from the perspective of helping the dancers win, because this is what I have seen, okay? I have seen people out on the dance floor, caller up on the stage, and the square breaks down. And they spend 10 minutes trying to figure out how to get into a line. Where do I go? Am I with my partner? Yada, yada, yada. And so everybody else is still dancing, the caller's still calling, and that square is helpless on the floor because nobody has taught them what to do. And there are callers in this area who just go on and on and on and on and on, and it's not fair to those dancers. One, because they haven't been taught what to do. They can't help themselves because they don't have a clue. And so out of respect for the dancers, I teach my dancers, if you are out on the dance floor and your square that you're in happens to break down, you can't rely on that caller on the stage, because some callers are very inconsiderate and don't get everybody home on a regular basis. I've been to a dance where we've gone home once during the whole patter tip. That's not right, but it happens, and it happens fairly frequently. And so I am teaching my dancers, if you're out there and you are in that kind of situation, here is what you do so that you guys can go back to dancing, even though that caller has not been paying attention as to what's going on.
That's understandable, Janet. One of the issues that you have, however, is, and I agree with both Daryl and Dawn on this, I will teach them how to make lines, but I will not do that until they're well into the program, because dancers inevitably have a few problems at the onset, and they're going to make a mistake. And immediately, and I have seen this too many times, new dancers, they'll turn the wrong way on a square through and they suddenly just stop, freeze, they go home, and then they start making lines, whereas they could have just kept on going or listen and tune in. A little bit later, and most callers will be able to fix the floor very quickly to an Alaman left or what have you. Later on, once they're a good way through at least the basic program or the basic mainstream program, I will teach that, because that's when they're going to start venturing out. As a class caller, I like them to be able to listen to me, and if there's a problem on the floor, I will see it broken down and I will get everybody home. Yes, there are callers out there that will extend their patter for 45 minutes before their Alaman left. Well, the answer is those people, unless that's the focus of the dance, like the Stuttgart Marathon, those people are calling for themselves. They're not calling for the dancers, and they shouldn't be behind the mic. That's just a personal opinion.
Right. We're probably 3/4 of the way through the class by the time I say something about it.
Yeah.
One of the things that you probably should teach, Janet, but not say it out loud, but, you know, go to dance callers that you enjoy, not just dancers that happen to be, you know, this guy's going to leave you, this guy's going to hurt you. Don't go to him too often.
Well, a lot of times that happens at festivals where they, you know, it's a whole slew of different people.
Okay.
And you just kind of get caught in the middle of it.
Okay.
You know, I've heard the dancers say, oh man, I can't wait to go back to this guy because he's broken me down completely and I can't dance to him, and I want to be able to get good enough so I can dance to him. That's giving the caller the wrong feedback. Talk with your feet. Daryl?
Chris Sword had a question on there as well a little bit earlier.
Oh, go ahead.
Chris? You had a question about reverse calls?
I don't see Chris.
I don't know, maybe Chris got tired of waiting, you think?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. There
Yeah.
he is.
He woke
Sorry, it
up.
was a question referring to a topic long ago, so I was not really listening on that one. So I just wanted to know from Don, he said in his presentation that he separates some calls because of similar movements. Like, for example, you said the flutter wheel and the reverse flutter wheel stuff.
Yeah.
So I just wondered whether you do that as well with the right hand and the left hand stuff, because there was also a question in the chat about that. So for example, a lead left and the lead right, or a veer left and the veer right. So would you just separate that in the US because you think the dancers can do it? Or would that also be a recommendation for everyone? So for example, for us in Germany.
Oh, wow. Those are very similar calls that I don't think you have to separate. Wow, that's a good question. No, I don't think I would separate veer left and veer right, even though I would probably only use veer left for a while because it's used much more frequently and I want them to learn the basic one. What was the other one besides? Oh, lead left and lead right.
The lead part, yeah.
Yeah, I know party nights and first night of class, I tell people, hopefully you've never danced before because I'm going to tell you everything you need to know except who the men are and who the women are and what your left hand is and what your right hand is. You have to know that yourself. In some groups, I have to tell the difference between forward and back, but I guess I expect them to learn to get a reasonable grasp of left and right. And so where the only similarity on veer, I think it's pretty obvious. If they're going the wrong way, they're going to bump into somebody. Before we go any further, I want to introduce Daryl Clendenin. Some of you, hopefully everybody knows, but if you, you don't have to listen to the introduction, that guy in the middle there. But Daryl and I have known each other forever. First communicating through Jay King. Communicating through Jay King's notes, then met each other, I think, at the second annual Caller Lab, have been on a cruise together, etc. Daryl's an old friend, and he happens to be somebody that is a Caller Lab member and a Board of Governors member and an accredited caller coach and etc. A music record producer in days past, Chinook Records, etc., etc. So when Daryl speaks, listen. And we're trying to get Daryl to do a session here, but we're trying to pick the right topic for it. So if you didn't know Daryl, it's too late now.
I apologize. My wife has reached a certain point of age, okay, and she doesn't always understand everything that's going on around us. I had a question. I'm new to this group, obviously. I did sit in last week and found it interesting. I'm wondering how many that are attending this group are really new callers. I find that interesting.
What do you think, Daryl? Fewer than 3 years? Is that what you mean, new? Fewer than 10?
Oh, is this a common? Well, yeah, we don't know where they come from. They could come from the Square Dance Callers group, the Newbie Caller, or the Callers in Training. Belong to all of them, right? Okay. I'd like to know how many are in their first year of wanting to learn to call. How many of them have been trying for a few years, but are still struggling trying to get clubs or get clubs started. When you start talking about making presentation, by the way, Don, you did a very nice job.
Thank you.
Very good.
I've trained you well to compliment me.
Yeah, right. You'll find that I'm serious, and I'll cut to the chase every time.
Let's start with the first question, Daryl. How many? Let's have a wave of hands. How many people are in their first year? We got 2, and then 3 faces we can't. 4 faces we can't see. 5 faces.
Well, I typed mine in the chat.
Excuse me? Oh, okay.
I typed mine in the chat. I'm 3 years.
How many are 5 years or fewer? Let's raise of hands. Or we got 2 additionals, 3. How many?
The ones that didn't raise their hands on the first time and apply to what Don just asked. 5 years or fewer. 1 that I see.
Oh, and you can count me in there. I'm 3.
Count me as well, Alan.
All right. Well, question.
50 years or more.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, I always wonder, all of these presentations like this are new. The Square Dance Callers, Newbie Callers, the Callers in Training and everything. Where would you put a presentation that's really going to be interesting and helpful to everybody? The questions asked, and I'm just learning about all of this stuff, mind you. I am a bit of a dinosaur. I've been in this a long time, but all of this technical type stuff, I'm just figuring out. Not a good computer person.
Please notice that he's got better lighting on him than most of us, that he's figured out how to make a studio out of it.
No, that's photography has nothing to do with computers. Trust me, this stuff is all mechanical. I buy the right stuff to begin with, I guess. Dumb luck. In any case, I would love to do a presentation on something. And I've heard several things this morning that I think I could probably give some information on. I would like to anyway. But I would rather do something that's going to be very, very helpful to you. That, to me, that's a real important part of it. Square dancing is in trouble, not just because of the coronavirus, which is a disaster right now. But I think we need to not only rebuild ourselves as callers, we need to start rebuilding the activity. And it's going to have to build from the bottom down. Now, a lot of the things, can I go ahead?
Keep going.
I don't want to dominate everything.
But I ended the meeting officially half an hour ago, so we can talk anything you want and anyone you want.